Thank you all for joining us this evening for a workshop on impact management. This is part two, carrying over from last semester when we did an introduction to impact management called More Than Measurement. We're so pleased. We now have over 30 people attending through the Zoom meeting. And I'm going to start off today by sharing a few tips on Zoom and introducing you to my colleagues who you see on the screen along with me. So I'm Lisa Hall. I am a fellow and professor of practice at Georgetown University at the Beeck Center, and I'm going to be leading this workshop. I'm also going to be joined by my colleague, Julie Abrams, who you can see on the screen, who's a longtime practitioner in impact management and someone that I've personally known for more than 15 years now. Also joining us on screen are my colleagues from the Beeck Center, Deanna Acosta, who is a program associate with us and will be helping to navigate the question and answers. And then Soumya Shruti, who's a student analyst and a senior at Georgetown University, who will be helping me to work the slide deck today. So I'm very excited about this session. And we also want to instruct you a little bit or give you some directions about using the Q&A functions. So if you scroll down to the bottom of the screen, for those of you who are not so familiar with Zoom, you'll see a bar that will include a Q&A icon along with a chat function. And you can ask questions. We'll be stopping along the way to check if you have questions about any of the material we've covered. You can ask questions using the Q&A function. Then we will also be stopping along the way to see what information you would like to share with the whole group, and we ask that you do that through chat. So there may be a few times when Julie or I ask a question to the group, and if you could respond through the chat function, and that way everybody gets to see the discussion around the particular question. Finally, I want to say look out for polls. We are going to be using polls throughout the presentation. And as an example, we're going to go to the first poll, which is a question about whether you participated in last fall's workshop. And this will help me to get a sense of the audience and the information to be covered. Okay, so we have less than 10% of the group who participated in the fall workshop, but don't worry if you didn't attend the session in the fall. This workshop is designed as a follow-up, but if you have a basic understanding of impact investing or have been a practitioner in the field, then you'll be able to easily follow along throughout the evening. So I want to stop. Oh, I realize I have to share the results. And there you go, so that you can see that 10% of the group was with us last fall, and more than 90% are joining us for the first time. So I also want to mention that the slide deck will be shared following the session, so you do not have to take copious notes. We're going to circulate it to everybody who's registered. And before we get started, I want to remind people about part two of this workshop, which will be held next week, same time, same bat channel. Please join us next Thursday for part two, where we're going to delve into some additional material, but also if we don't get to all the questions that are asked this evening, then we can answer those in part two. So whenever I talk about impact management, I like to begin with this slide. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And I think during this time of crisis that we're living through, these words matter more than ever, because sometimes impact management and quantitative measures, even qualitative measures, don't do a good job of capturing what's going on in the moment. And we need to be mindful of that. So impact management is not a perfect practice, and not everything that counts can be counted. And it's also important to keep in mind that not everything that can be counted counts, because sometimes we count things mindlessly or we measure things without really thinking about what it means and whether it matters. But please know that I and everyone at the Beeck Center are sending you positive and supportive thoughts during this uncertain and difficult time. And we recognize that we're all facing different challenges, but at the same time, we're battling a common enemy, COVID-19. We're all learning to operate in a very different environment. This virtual environment that we're using tonight is new to many of us, including me. This is the first time I will be delivering a workshop virtually. So please be patient. Please bear with us as we are almost certainly going to stumble at times with the technology. And just hang in there if we have a few blips along the way. If something crashes, we'll be right back. If we have a little glitch, we'll try to fix it as soon as possible. We're now up to 47 people participating in the workshop and really happy to have everyone here. And pleased that virtual technology allowed us to expand the number of people who are participating in the session. So now, before we jump into the main presentation, which for those of you who are just joining, the presentation will be shared with everyone, so you don't have to take like really detailed notes because we're going to be circulating the deck. But before we launch into the presentation, we wanted to do 3 quick polls to give us a sense of who's in the room. So the first poll, or the next poll, is what is your background related to impact? If people could respond to that question, and I think Soumya is going to help launch that poll. Or Deanna. Somebody's going to launch it. So it's not showing up for me, Deanna. There we go. What's your background related to impact? And so we're trying to understand if folks are currently working in impact, never worked in impact, but are really interested, or have worked in impact before. And I'll give it a moment so people can complete the poll, and then in 5 seconds, I'll end that poll. Okay, it looks like we've got the responses that we're gonna get. So I'm gonna end the poll so you can see the results. And you can see it's like really pretty evenly split. There's more than 35% have worked in impact, but 22% have not worked in impact before. And then 40%, which is the majority, have never worked in impact. There are the results for you to see. The next poll that we're going to launch is around your current occupation. And if folks could respond there, we'd love to know how many students are with us this evening versus professionals or practitioners or just curious learners. So as we expected, most of our attendees tonight appear to be students, and I'll share the results here in 5 seconds for anybody who wants to put a last-minute response in. Okay. And I'll share the results. You see more than half the group are students. And we also have a handful of people who are curious results. So the last poll that we're going to do here is around what motivated you to participate in the workshop. So if you could respond to this next poll, we're interested to know, do you want to learn about impact management broadly because you're new to it? Are you more interested in the detail around the tools, frameworks, and methodologies? Or are you interested in learning about career in impact management? And I think this question allows you to answer, I think I stopped polling accidentally. So Deanna, you may have to relaunch it.
I will relaunch now. Sorry, everyone. Relaunching now.
Okay, there we go. So if you could respond to this poll, and then we're going to get started with the main presentation. Okay, we'll do the same here. Give it 5 seconds before we end the polling. And it looks like we've got most people responding. We'll end the poll and I'll share the results. It looks like the majority of folks are interested in learning about the tools and frameworks, which we are going to do a deep dive around that. And you'll get to see some tools today, and then also get a preview of tools that we'll cover in the next session next week. Okay, so we're done with polls for the moment, and we have a little bit of information that will help us focus the presentations. And let me briefly cover here in the agenda what we're going to discuss today. So we were almost through with the welcome. We're going to spend some time very briefly sharing with you the work that we do here at the Beeck Center. And then we're going to do a review of the fall workshop. So for those of you who weren't at the fall workshop, you'll get a little taste of what we covered then. And then we'll deep dive into tools, frameworks, and methodologies, which it sounds like most people are interested in learning about. And we'll then have Julie as our special guest talk about her career and share her story in impact management. And then we'll do another deep dive around impact management considerations based on industry. And at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. We'll run through or until 7 o'clock. This is scheduled for an hour and a half. And I'm pleased that we now have over 50 people on the line. That's really exciting. And so as a reminder, or for those who may be joined after I said this, we are going to circulate the deck, so you don't need to take like very detailed notes, because you will get a copy. Anyone who's registered will get a copy. So let's go to what we do at the Beeck Center. We work across several areas to scale innovation, and also are accelerating social change across many sectors. And we serve as and operate within the Georgetown University as an experiential hub that has a twofold mandate to train students and also to incubate new ideas in service to the common good. So we do this across 3 portfolios: data and digital, fair finance, which is the portfolio that I lead, and sustainable student impact, which is focused on training social leaders for the future. So we go to the next slide. We'll see a little bit here about the work of the Fair Finance Initiative, and I really encourage everyone to go check out the website to learn more about what we're doing to drive impact in low-income communities, integrating immigrant and refugees, creating equitable capital markets. There's more detailed information on our website about each of the programs under the Fair Finance Initiative, where we are really trying to write the rules for shared economic well-being. The team itself includes several fellows, and you can find information on their backgrounds and bios on the website. The team also includes a number of students who are really pleased to be part of our work at the Beeck Center. And you can see Soumya is on this slide, who is helping us today, as well as several non-resident fellows who are engaged in our work. And again, all the bios are on the website if you're interested in more background on the members of the team for Fair Finance. There's a page here on my background. I don't expect everybody to read this in the short time it'll be up on the screen, but I've had a long career in impact investing. I like to say that I've been doing impact investing since before they called it that. So I started off my career in the late 80s working as a construction lender for affordable housing. And I've spent time in the nonprofit sector, the for-profit sector, and in government. I worked for the National Economic Council or under the Clinton administration, and so have done a number of things that have touched the world of impact investing. So I also want to mention very briefly here some of the background about our special guest, Julie Abrams, who is going to be speaking in a moment about her story in impact management and impact investing. She is the founder and managing director of Impact Investing Analytics, an advisory and consulting firm. And you're going to hear more in great detail about the work that Julie has done throughout her career, all of which has touched in some form or fashion on impact management. So hopefully you'll get a sense from Julie's remarks about how all of this applies to the real world and how you could use it in a career for those of you who are students thinking about a career in impact investing or impact management. So now that you know a little bit about what we do and who we are, we're going to just do a quick check-in, see how everybody's doing. If you could give us an idea of how you're doing as I kind of make a transition here to the next section, which is going to be a review of the workshop last fall. We seem to have most people in the category of great, which is terrific to hear. I'm going to end the poll and let's see, and share the results. So the winner here is great, which is very good to hear that the 51 people that we have on the line are feeling pretty good. And I'm more in the category, I think, of hanging in there. But thank you for sharing. And just waiting for the day so you can go outside again is also a good number at 21%. Let's see. Okay, so there everybody can see the results. And now we'll move on to the review from last fall's workshop. So this is going to be really quick. I'm warning you that we're going to go through these slides at a fast pace, but please click on the chat box if you want to share a little bit about why impact management is important to you. We want this to be interactive, and there are some on the line who did participate in the fall workshop, so they will have seen all this information before. You can spend some time on the chat and let us know that why impact management is important to you and what you're hoping to get from today's session. So going to the next slide, Soumya, let's go to the overview. And so we spent some time in the fall talking about the ongoing practice of measuring both the risk of negative impacts, which is very much a focus of ESG or environmental and social governance data, and also looking at how you measure the impacts so that we can reduce the negative and increase the positive. And that definition actually comes from the GIN. They use that in how they describe the impact management. And the GIN is the major trade association for impact investing. It stands for Global Impact Investing Network. And so in our last workshop, we covered the 5 dimensions of impact, which we'll touch upon again here, but also the ABCs. And so I provided a little bit more detail about defining impact versus defining what we mean by impact management of the context, in the context of impact investing. Impact is used by social scientists, and it's been adopted in the impact investing world to think about what the negative or positive changes that you're seeking for people or the planet. And impact investing, of course, is defined as investments with the intention to generate positive, net positive, measurable social and environmental outcomes alongside a financial return. So if we go to the next few slides, this is just some context on how a researcher might think about the term impact and the elements that they would be concerned about, which is very different than what an impact investor would consider. And so as we move to this slide, we see that impact investors are generally concerned about the what, who, how much, contribution, and risk. And the what is really thinking about what outcomes are occurring and what do those outcomes mean to the people and the planet who are experiencing the impact. The who is what it's exactly as it sounds, who has experienced the outcome. And this relates to geography, but also if the beneficiaries or the stakeholders are underserved in some way, how does that relate to the outcome? And how much of the outcome occurs in any period of time is the how much, and what's the scale. of it. The contribution is, what is the business or enterprise or social venture? What is their contribution to the outcome that you're seeking and impact? And then lastly, what is the risk? And this is a framework that was created by the Impact Management Project. And you can see on the side that the Impact Management Project has a website that I really encourage people to check out. It has a lot of good detailed information. So as we keep going through the review, the other piece that we touched on in the fall is around the ABCs of impact intention. And through the Impact Management Project, advisors and wealth managers have come to a consensus around these categories that you can place investors into. A, act to avoid harm. B, benefit stakeholders. And C, contribute to solutions. And this is a great framework for thinking about where an impactor investor fits in terms of the intention that they have when they make an impact investment. And if you remember, going back to the definition of impact investing, you always want to see the investor have some intention. I think that's the last thing on the review is we talked last time about the evolution of impact investing and the changes that have occurred over time. So we've seen impact investing move from what was really a pre-impact investing concept of negative screening, where you would screen out certain types of activities or goods and services like tobacco, or very famously in the apartheid movement, there were many investors who decided that they would not invest in South Africa. Another example of negative screening might be weapons, that there's some investors who decide to screen out weapons from their portfolio. Versus positive screening, which is really where impact investing took us, is to think more about what the positive impact is that you're trying to create, rather than the negative that you're trying to keep out of your portfolio. So that's been part of the evolution. Also, outputs versus outcomes, and we're going to talk in more detail after Julie's presentation about outputs versus outputs versus outcomes. And then there's also been this trend around measurement, which is really just looking at metrics and counting things, to impact management, which is a much more holistic approach to thinking about the impact that you are seeking and trying to create. The last trend that we've seen is a move from randomized control studies or trials, which is the RTC, and versus lean data. So trying to look more on the ground and collect data from actual customers and beneficiaries and stakeholders, rather than trying to do very complicated academic randomized trials. So I wanted to stop there, I think. And we are taking questions from the chat room. And Deanna, are there any, I'm sorry, not from the chat room, from the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a bar that has a little icon for Q&A. And if you have questions about anything that we've covered so far in the review, this is the time to ask them before we move on to a quick poll and deep dive into the tools, frameworks, and methodologies. So it doesn't look like, Deanna, that we have any questions.
No questions at the moment.
Okay, and if anyone's having difficulty accessing the Q&A, please let us know in the chat, and Deanna will respond to you.
Yes, we do have some incoming questions now. So
okay.
This question is, do you feel like there is any value to more academic control groups?
So I think that used to be considered a gold standard, and that frankly, what has been experienced in impact investing is that it's very difficult to get a control group, and sometimes there are even moral issues around having a control group. So in a typical randomized control study, you would have a control group where they did not benefit from the intervention. And if the whole point is that the intervention is having a social or environmental impact, you don't want to keep that from anyone if you can provide it to more people. So the idea of having a control group has some moral considerations. And then it's also very hard to control across a study to make sure that you really have identified what the intervention is doing versus what's happening through some other mechanism. Very difficult to create control. So I think they're still useful. They have a value, but in the past they really were the gold standard. And now people are looking much more at lean data and what you can collect from folks on the ground. Do we have any other questions, Deanna?
We do, yes. The other one is, are there any examples of organizations that do a good job of impact management that you can share?
Oh, wow. So, I think that there are both fund managers and enterprises that do a very good job of impact management. And I hate to call specific groups out because, of course, I'll forget some. But I think Acumen has had a really long history of doing impact management even before people started using this term. Bridges, which is based in London, would also be a good example. And of course, I have to name my alma mater, Calvert, Impact Capital, I think also does a really good job of measuring impact. But what I would encourage you to do is check out the Impact Management Project website, where there is a collaboration of literally hundreds of organizations that have been working on impact management practices, working to harmonize metrics. And you will see on the website some of the organizations that have been very active and collaborated, and they've got lots of research papers showing how people actually incorporate impact management into their investing.
All right, and then we have another question. Between RCT and lean data, which one is used in the impact investing space?
Yeah, and I think still both. I think you still do see randomized control studies, but increasingly lean data is being used. And there I would encourage folks to take a look at 60 decibels, which has been a real leader in lean data and really helped to promote the concept and has created a whole business around, particularly in the age of technology when almost everyone, even in emerging and frontier markets, walks around with a smartphone, that the ability to collect data on the ground from actual beneficiaries and actual stakeholders has really increased. And so they've done a lot of work in thinking about that, and they're called 60 decibels. So I think we should probably move on now to tools, frameworks, and methodologies. And someone's asking to spell it. You'll have to tell us what you want us to spell, and I'll leave it to Deanna to respond to you while we move through the deck. So this next poll is asking about have you used impact management tools and frameworks in the past? And so if we could launch that. And so it's a pretty straightforward question. And it looks like, as people are responding, that most people have not. So I will keep that in mind as I walk through these specific tools, and I imagine that we'll have a lot of questions. So I'm going to end the poll in 5 seconds and then share the results with everyone. And the majority of folks have not used impact measurement tools in the past. It looks like 45% of the group have not. Okay, so we'll try to walk through the next slides very deliberately. And oh, did the results not get shared? There we go. Okay. All right. And so Soumya, if you could take us to the first slide in tools, frameworks, and methodologies. So hopefully people have heard about the UN SDGs. Oh, and also we wanted to ask people on the line, particularly if you are a practitioner, to contribute to the right or to the chat session any tools that you think are particularly good that have been helpful for you in your work. And we're going to talk about 4 tools in particular today. And some of them are more methodologies or frameworks or principles. But the other thing that you should be aware of is in the chat, you'll see the links to each of the tools or methodologies that I'm going to discuss today. And when you receive the deck, the links are embedded in the presentation, so you'll be able to go to the website directly. But the SDGs, the UN SDGs, are a way of communicating around impact. They're a tool that provides language that frankly was not very consistent in the past. When people would talk about impact, they didn't have clear buckets or categories that they were placing that impact in. And so the UN Sustainable Development Goals has given us a shared language, which really has been adopted broadly in the impact investing community. These SDGs have been agreed to by nearly 200 countries. They were designed in consultation with a really wide range of stakeholders. And they're very comprehensive. It's really hard to think of an impact that does not fit into one of these 17 categories. And if you go to the website, and again, the links are being provided in the chat by Deanna, if you go to the links and go into the site, you'll see a great deal of detail behind each of these sustainable development goals. I want to stop, and of course that's my dog, so I can't ask anybody to put it on mute because that's my dog in the background. If you could, in the chat, ask, or I'm sorry, in the Q&A, in the question and answer box, let us know if you have any questions about the Sustainable Development Goals. Deanna, do we have any questions in the chat?
No questions at the moment.
Okay, so I will move on to the next methodology we want to cover, which is Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. And SASB is a way of thinking about how to capture data and report on sustainability efforts and issues. Some of you may have heard of FASB, which is Financial Accounting Standards Board. Well, SASB is a similar concept that's trying to help investors understand the ESG efforts of particular companies and firms. And so again, if you look in the chat box, you will see links to the SASB website. And also remember that the deck will be provided after the session, so don't worry about having to take notes on all of this. You'll be able to go into the links and learn more about each of these tools and methodologies, and bring questions with you to next week's session if we haven't covered all the questions today. But SASB has grown substantially over the years. There are several sub-tools within SASB that are linked here, the Materiality Map, which looks at across, and we know that this particular page is going to be really difficult for folks to read. The links are there so that you can go in and navigate the site yourself. But Soumya, if you could go back one. I want to point out here that the Materiality Map looks at several dimensions, environments, all the way to innovation. And it also, as a tool, SASB covers many industries. So from consumer goods to transportation, and even things like extractives, which I think people don't normally think of mining as having positive ESG, but I think there's a range across mining where in fact some mining companies have put into place really great practices that make it much more safe than the average mining activity. And so across all these many industries, there's 77 of them. I only listed a few of them here. And then across these dimensions, SASB helps folks to capture data, put it in categories, and then be able to report out to investors about ESG factors, environmental, social, and governance factors. There are also specific standards for each sector. So I've listed the kind of high level categories, but within the categories, there are specific individual subsectors. And then lastly, SASB provides this great engagement guide for investors that again helps with language and ways to discuss investments in companies. So I'm not going to go through the next page in detail because I know it's hard to read. But if we could move to the next slide, you'll see a little bit about how the standards navigator works. And there's actually an example here of a company, which you can see, the American Electric Power Company. And SASB helps to rate it in comparison to averages for all the data that it collects in this particular industry. And it helps you to rank the company's leadership and also their disclosure in terms of how much they have disclosed about their work in ESG over time, over a 3-year trend. I think this is the last slide on SASB. And so I'm going to stop there to see what questions people may have about SASB and how it works. If you could put those through to the Q&A, and Deanna will let me know what questions we might have there.
So we have a question around the relationship between ESG metrics and impact measurement. So distinguishing between those two. So the example is, are they interchangeable terms or is one part of the other?
So let me make sure I understand the question. Can you say it again, Deanna?
Yeah, what is the relationship between ESG metrics and impact measurement?
So this is a question about good ESG practice and process versus impact investing. And everybody has a little bit different way of thinking about how to differentiate. What I would say, and I think there are many who would agree, is that ESG is really looking at environmental, social, and government practices. And that's why SASB is a standards tool that allows you to compare your company's practices to another company's practices. So there are some generally agreed upon standards for governance, for example. The one I like to always highlight is diversity, right? That it's good governance to have a diverse corporate board and diverse senior management. It's also good governance to have certain committees in place, like an audit committee for a company, whether it's private or privately held or publicly held. And so those are examples of the kind of things that people focus on with ESG. And some people might say that ESG can be more of a checklist of whether you've actually checked off the right practice. I think what SASB does is allow you to look at those practices in comparison to what other companies are doing, other firms. But it also creates, there's a range, so it's not so much of a checkbox or a checklist. Impact investing, to differentiate, is almost always focused on meeting the needs of some underserved community, individual, or the planet. So you can think of the planet and the environment as being underserved. And so impact investing goes more deeply than ESG, because it really looks at the net positive impact And the net is very important as well, because the net positive impact is looking at, is there more positive than there is negative? So that by its very nature means that you're also capturing what negatives are happening out of an activity or a business or a company's goods and service. So like the example that I used, I think I used this last time in the fall workshop, is that someone once tried to convince me that fracking is a impact investment. And the case that they made was that fracking generates lots of jobs, which is absolutely true. That fracking in all over the world, but certainly in the US, has created a lot of new jobs. But it also has very detrimental environmental impacts. And so net, it's very hard to make a case for fracking to be an impact investment. So you're looking at a net positive impact, whereas ESG is more directly looking at practices on the social side. It could be looking at worker rights. It could be looking at supply chain issues, whereas impact investing is focused on how are you serving an underserved or a need in society or the environment. So hopefully that is responsive to the question. Are there other questions that we might take? I'm not exactly sure how much time we have left. I want to leave plenty of room for Julie to talk about her career, but maybe we can take one more question, Deanna?
Yep, one more. And so the question is SASB only used by investors, or is it useful for entrepreneurs as well?
So it is mostly a tool for investors, but the entrepreneurs are the ones who capture the data that the investors are then interested in looking at. So that's a very short answer, and we can perhaps go into more detail about that in the second session. So I want to make sure we get to the IFC principles. We have two sets of principles that I want to cover, and we will take all these questions and make sure that we have answers for them at the next session. But if we could move to the IFC operating principles. And so IFC operating principles are a framework, and they're really a reference point as a way to think about them. And they're focused on evaluating impact management systems. So rather than being applied to a company or an enterprise or a social venture, IFC operating principles are applied to impact management systems. So it's a way for an investor in a fund to assess, is the fund manager doing a good job of managing impact? And also for them to look at businesses and see if they've got strong impact management systems. But it's really about the system and not the impact itself that's being generated. So if we go to the next page, and I think we have in the chat box the link to the impact principles, but we've also included them here. There are 8 of them. And I'm just going to pull out the first one as the example, which I think is a really important principle for any impact management system, which is define your strategic impact objective. And I remember one time when I was working in the family office having a conversation with my colleagues in the philanthropy and the charitable arm of the family office, and they were just astounded because they looked at me, they were like, impact investors don't start off with objectives, which just sounds insane to somebody who works in a foundation space, because they are always starting off with a theory of change and what your objective is and your hypothesis about how you are going to meet that objective. And for a long time, impact investors just kind of invested in themes or industries. Like you would have an impact investor decide, education is really important to me, but they would have no theory of change around what objective they were trying to accomplish. Were they trying to improve literacy? Were they trying to get people employed by having better education? Those types of details would just be missing from the approach. And so this first principle that the IFC, and IFC stands for International Finance Corporation, which is a development finance institution. And they've outlined these principles, and I am a fan, especially of the very first principle, which is define your objective. But all of these principles, as you will see on this page, and then if you go into detail on the site, are really about the process or the impact management system and evaluating that system and trying to assess, is it a good system or not based on these principles. So I think the last tool that we're going to mention today is UNPRI. And yeah, the PRI, let me actually give folks a moment to read through this because I think this slide is particularly self-explanatory, but it is also coming out of the United Nations, and you'll see a link to it to the right of your screen in the Zoom chat. And there are, hundreds of signatories to the UNPRI. It's supported by, but not part of the UN, and developed by investors for investors, mostly around ESG. So I wanted to stop there. I think I just have a few minutes to see what questions people have before I turn it over to Julie. And we also want to reference the tools that we're going to cover in next week's session because there's so many. I mean, it's really, there's been a proliferation of tools, although many of the ones that I'm focused on have been around for decades. But there are proliferation of tools, and if it seems like there are a lot of them to you, it's because there are a lot. And this next page gives you kind of a preview of the tools that we're going to cover in next week's session.
So Lisa, most of the questions seem to be around SASB and some of the previous slides. Mm-hmm. There are no current questions around these last tools, so yeah, maybe we can come back to them at the end of the chat. Okay, great. Well, with that, if there aren't any more questions about any of the tools or the preview here on the slide for next week's workshop, I'm really excited to hand it over to Julie Abrams. As I mentioned before, I've known Julie for more than 15 years, and we worked together at Calvert Impact Capital. She's had a long and illustrious career in this work, and I'm going to pass it over to you, Julie, to share your story with the students and practitioners on the line.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm very pleased to speak with all of you. It was helpful to hear the polls in terms of people's background and interest in, all of that. So this is going to be a bit more of a personal part of the presentation. Lisa's given you incredibly rich content this week, and hope you'll all come back next week as well. As she mentioned, I've been working in impact investing for many years before it was called that, in fact, for really over 30 years, since the mid-1980s. So technically, I guess that makes me a pioneer, something along those lines. And I'm just going to give you some select examples of some of the roles I've played, obviously not exhaustive. And afterward, I'm going to try to extrapolate some of the lessons learned and principles for impact investing, but most particularly for impact management, since that's our topic today, that I developed from my experience. Now, obviously, I should say that what we all bring to the table is, how we were raised. And I guess in my case, I was raised with a deep sense of social justice and fairness, and really to be inclusive and very much always have a big tent, so to speak, particularly from my grandmother and mother. Half of my grandparents were immigrants, so that issue is very near and dear to my heart. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So in terms of my background, one of the earlier things I did was digging an irrigation canal in rural Kenya, which actually was quite formative, and really I would say is how I trace my current work today. And in this case, the impact of it was very clear, because only with this irrigation canal could people who lived in this rural village in Kenya, Machu in Machakos district, get water for their crops when there wasn't rainfall. At the time, there was also no running water or electricity in the village, and happily all of those are in place now. One thing I liked about this, which became one of my own principles, is that I guess I'd call it self-determination. The villagers, people who lived in that town and village, were in charge of the project, and all the foreigners, such as myself, were not. And they knew best what was needed. They knew their soil. They knew what time of day made the most sense to work in terms of how hot it was. And so I guess that became a principle about, know those people who are closest to what you're trying to do. An additional experience I had, which was also formative, was during college, actually. And as Lisa had mentioned, one of the things was the South African apartheid, which has since been dismantled. But at the time, I was the only student on a college investment advisory council where we sponsored shareholder resolutions to companies in which the college held stocks, which of course is something that any shareholder has an option to do. Many colleges and many institutions were doing so, and I highlighted this Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility as an example of those that provided these guidelines. One experience that really struck me personally at the time was that among the many companies to which we sponsored these shareholder resolutions was Coca-Cola. And Coca-Cola sent 4 people to our small college in a small town in the Midwest. And I was kind of shocked that we mattered that much, quite honestly. And it was a real wake-up call to the value of the role we could play through investments. And so I think that really traced my interest in investing for impact to that. Now, as Lisa mentioned earlier on, there was negative screens, which is what this was, meaning to exit South Africa because everything else had been tried. And so this would be sort of a precursor to the more intentionality for positive impact that is a hallmark of impact investing. Next slide, please. Thank you. Then I went on to Women's World Banking, which is an international nonprofit, which works globally. And they were trying to address a pain point, which was that low-income women all over the world, including the United States, didn't necessarily have access to the financial system, including credit and other financial products. Some of these women were often illiterate, in fact. And so what Women's World Banking did in terms of an impact investment was worked with banks initially, such as Barclays Bank in Kenya and Ghana, for example, and tried to limit the risk that these banks took in order for them to encourage them to lend to women. And they did that by sharing the risk with Women's World Banking that had raised funds for this, with the local bank, which only took a portion of the risk, and then local programs. And all of the Women's World Banking programs were locally incorporated institutions run by and for women. And so you'll see when I describe some of my other hallmarks, I think that is important as well. Then getting into the impact measurement and management, as Lisa mentioned, impact management includes measurement, but it's much more than that. But initially, we were really focused in the industry more on measurement because we didn't even have it before we could broaden to what's the incredible work being done by Impact Management Project and others on impact management. So just to give you a few examples, and this might surprise those of you who've been in the field because it's kind of shocking what we didn't have, which we had to develop, which many people and my colleagues did. So I'll give 3 examples from the microfinance or financial inclusion world. So the first thing is you might assume that the financial metrics were straightforward, but that the social environmental might have been harder. But in fact, even for financial metrics, we didn't all have the same definitions. So to give you an example, there's something called PAR 30, which means portfolio at risk, PAR 30, meaning any loan that's overdue by more than 30 days. Now, first of all, the banking sector doesn't even use that terminology. They use NPL, non-performing loans over 30 days. So the first thing, I was part of a group that recommended that we use the terms the banks would understand so they could even understand what we were talking about. But then within that definition, what we found was that different institutions interpreted it differently. So you think 30 days is 30 days, but in fact, if you have loans, to be specific in this example, that were renegotiated or restructured or refinanced. So just imagine all the loans today during COVID-19, so many of them are something is being adjusted because of this reality. So in this case that I was mentioning here, some institutions would count those restructured loans and some wouldn't. And so you couldn't compare any data. And so I worked with different groups such as SEEP, MIX, CGAP, and others to come up with agreed upon definitions of all these metrics, which now are industry standards. And the publications I've shown here were just a few examples of those that many of us worked on. Another example was comparability among ratings. So of course, if you have ratings, you want to be able to compare different entities with those, so different social enterprises or the like. In microfinance, for example, there were 4 rating agencies. They all had different methodologies, different Greek letters, Roman letters, 7, 8 categories, different definitions. And so nobody could compare anything. It sounds kind of crazy, but anyway, so I was hired to compare and develop a harmonized rating comparability amongst them. Part of the challenge of this was none of them wanted to provide their proprietary confidential methodology information, and so I was allowed to see all of them, but their peers could not. And so another thing that you'll come across in this impact field is, and in probably any field, is the need for trust in relationships. So that was another example. And then my last example here was, and again, these are just the financial metrics. We haven't even gotten to social and environmental, was the debt default rate. And by that, I mean that eventually in the microfinance area, we did eventually get data about how well the clients repaid their loans. But what we didn't have anything on was how well the institutions that had borrowed money to lend to the clients, how well did they pay it back? And the myth was that, oh, well, they always pay back. So I was hired to do a study, the first and I think so far the only study, I haven't seen an update, to find out what was that rate. And so it was really hunting, it was kind of anthropological, it was getting information from all over the world. And find out what that rate is. And the quick answer is it was 2%. And I'll just give you the headline, which was the paper that I wrote for the results of this research that had been sponsored, is called "Zero is Not the Number." So there was not a zero debt default rate. So this, I just am trying to give you a little bit of a flavor of what kind of preceded where we are today in 2020. Next slide, please. Thank you. Then we move on to really when we're broadening to impact reporting. So the GIN that Lisa mentioned, Global Impact Investing Network, GIIN, GIN, is the home of IRIS, which are impact reporting and investment standards. So they're one of the several sets of metrics. And I was part of the first group that was developing the IRIS for financial services, which literally involved a number of practitioners for financial services domestically in the US and internationally, trying to figure out what would be metrics that would be of interest, which ones would be comparable between domestic and international entities, and also how could they possibly be relevant to look and compare to investments, impact investments in other sectors besides financial services. IRIS has gone on for many iterations. The current iteration is IRIS Plus. This is a publicly available database and taxonomy that you can find. If you, I don't know if you want to put that in the chat or not, but that's, anyone can look it up. And another group in terms of financial inclusion that I worked on was the Economist Intelligence Unit, part of Economist Magazine companies. There was a shift from microfinance, which are really products such as loans, leasing, insurance, to financial inclusion, which really is a goal. So we went from what products do we want to offer to what goal do we want to accomplish. We wanted low income and marginalized people in the US and around the world to be included in the financial sector. And so there was a group convened to talk about that and how we could reinterpret, use new definitions, and how we could update that. Next slide, please. And lastly, I'll talk about something which was kind of sitting, gathering dust and has literally been dusted off very recently because of COVID-19. So this is pretty up to the minute. So there was a group of a number of impact investors that had come together. This is back in 2011, so almost a decade ago, and excuse me, come up with sorry, what were called voluntary debt workout principles. And why did we do this? We wanted to say, is there something unique about microfinance? And I'd also broaden that to say impact investors that is the same as any loan workout situation, meaning when they're problem loans and their issues, versus is there something unique about them? And so this group convened for a number of sessions, and we came up with 10 working principles. Thank you. And what we did, we started by looking at what do commercial lenders and investors, what do they use? There's something called the International Federation of Insolvency Professionals, INSOL, and they have a set of principles. We want to say what is the same and what is different, because we have some social impact goals here. And so these principles that we came up with related specifically to that. And it was, again, very much of a collaborative undertaking. I would say, literally, I spoke last week with someone who is part of a large group of impact investors that are looking at their loan portfolios and their equity portfolios and wondering if these, almost decade-old workout principles are accurate, relevant to COVID-19 or not. And so the answer is, in some ways, yes, and they need, in some ways, no. So they're being used now, we're updating them to say which of these principles still hold or not. So I'd say a takeaway from that is look to history. Some things may be useful. Some things may be useful but need to be updated. Some things should be discarded because they're no longer relevant. But history is a way of repeating itself. Not exactly, but you always want to see what has been done in the past. And I would say particularly in impact management and impact investing, much has been done, so much has still to be done, but look to find out what we've learned from the past so that you're not reinventing a wheel, but always look to the present and future. Next slide, please. So now I want to try to extrapolate, focusing a bit on impact investing, but particularly impact management, our topic at hand here, from some of my life experiences to date. And I've got a lot more coming, so stay tuned. I guess the first one, which I hope is maybe disconcerting, but hopefully heartening for students in our group, of which we had 56% from our poll, initially, is that you can't plan for a career in a field that does not yet exist. So you can't really plan out your life and your career exactly. I couldn't have planned to have a career initially in microfinance and eventually in impact investing because it didn't exist. When I went to business school, I had been working in microfinance, and when I told people about it, they thought it sounded fascinating. Not one single person had heard of it, and that's because it was still very niche and very obscure. Now, if you talk to someone, everyone's heard of it. And so, look for opportunities, but there's many things that don't yet exist, and go find them, or even better yet, create them. Now, in terms of some of the principles, and I've tried to link these to some of the experiences I discussed with you, is to be client-centric. And I think this is just so fundamental. It's part of human-centered design. It's part of design thinking. It's grounded in empathy. And really, all impact management should measure the impact of the beneficiaries, both as you see it as the measurer and the manager of it, but as experienced by those people. And really that harkens back to that first example I gave you, where in digging the irrigation canal with folks in Machu, Kenya. Another principle is investing has great power for impact. Use it wisely for good. It can be used wisely or unwisely. Lisa gave a great example about fracking, that you could interpret it in different ways. And this harkens back to my example about the shareholder resolutions related to South African apartheid. I would say innovate to address impact pain points and create solutions which you can then manage. And this, the example I'd given you there was women's role banking. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then I call it Abrams Impact Management 4 C's. Those are clarity, consistency, collaboration, and choice. Clarity, and I think this is important, particularly with impact measurement and management, is be clear. What is your theory of change? What are those 5 dimensions of impact? What are those ABCs that Lisa described and went over, reviewed, of impact intentionality, all of which the Impact Management Project came up with, but be very clear about those. I'd also say be very clear about even your definitions, and I'll give a real quick example on this. I was working on a reproductive health impact investment, and we started talking about equity. Now, equity to a finance person means part of the balance sheet, below assets and below liabilities. But in health, the equity means access and fairness and access to getting health services. So just be clear about that. Be consistent in your impact management approach so you can measure impact over time. If you need to change it, that's fine, but be consistent and know when and how you can do that. I've described the many ways I've collaborated with wonderful colleagues, and so I don't think much of impact investing's best work resulted from collaboration. For example, those voluntary debt workout principles I mentioned. And then choice. This is actually important for impact measurement and management. The impactee, that the group that's having the impact, really needs to have a say in determining how the impact is measured, what's managed. So you can't just always look from a distance, say, okay, I'll decide as the impact investor, but really you need to ask them and talk to them. I think that's very important. I'll wrap up very briefly here. Build bridges, and by that I mean there's different groups that use different impact management approaches. For example, companies will use key performance indicators or KPIs. More nonprofit government folks may use monitoring and evaluation. So be that bridge that can explains how one is comparable to the other. And then again, looking to the past, present, future when solving for crises, as mentioned. Last slide, please. Thank you. So I'll challenge you, and I don't know you need to do this now, but after this session, I would ask you, what is your mission? And what are your impact investing and impact management principles? Now, I would suggest you write it down. You put it in Google Doc, you can keep updating it for the rest of your life. I actually, when I started out early on, I determined, and I wrote this down, my mission early on was to help people take control of their lives through economic means, which is not to say that was the only way, but that was what was important to me. So you can have your own principles and mission. You don't have to only have it for an organization with which you're affiliated. I'm going to stop now, and if there's time for questions, I'm happy to answer them, or we can wait till the end. Thank you, and you'll be hearing some more amazing information from Lisa after this, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Julie. So we do have a few minutes for questions. I believe about 5 minutes, right, Sonia? Maybe less. We're good. Okay. All right. So we have about 4 to 5 minutes for questions, Julie. So if anyone would like to type them in the Q&A, this is a great moment to do so. Perfect. All right. So we have another question. Do you have any recommendations for those without private sector experience interested in building a career in impact investing? Any certificates, classes, or volunteer opportunities that might be a good place to start?
Sure, no, great question. Thank you. So I guess I would say first of all, there's no right answer, which is helpful and also confusing. I personally think private sector experience is very valuable for impact investing. There have also been studies that have shown that the people that are most effective actually in impact investing are those that have worked in multiple sectors, specifically the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and the government sector, which we call the trifecta. Lisa, I think, has a trifecta, right? And which is great. So I think that, well, first of all, don't forget your career is long. For those of your students, if you're undergrad or grad, you have decades ahead of you, which is great because there's lots of time to do lots of things. Some people go ahead and actually get a private sector job initially. For example, I worked with what's now PwC, and I worked with Fortune 500 companies, and I worked with large corporations doing their strategy, sell-side equity, privatizations, and honed my investment skills that way, and then went and worked in impact investing. There are, you can take classes, I would say, internships, volunteer opportunities, any kind of job. And there's, really what I'm looking for when I see someone who wants to do impact investing is what experience do they have? So even, I mean, obviously we all want to be paid for our work, not unpaid, but if you can, and that may be a luxury, you know, if there's something that's even an unpaid role, but you get experience, I think that's really great. You know, don't mind to take something low level, early, you know, an entry level job if it's in the skill set that you want, and figure out what skills and what kind of work you want to do. And you can do very financial work, you can do very marketing work, you can do very impact metrics work and impact management work. So kind of figure that out. So I'll stop there.
Another question is, are there any tax incentives for impact investing? And if not, would that be a beneficial policy decision?
Tax incentives for whom? For institutions or for whom?
It looks like in general, but and like how does that influence policy?
Right. So yeah, no, so that's a question for an institutional investor. It depends. So I mean, right now, for example, for individuals, if you donate money, you would get a tax write-off. So that's not an impact investment, but that's a tax incentive. However, except for this year, someone has to itemize. Opportunity zones are a large, you know, that's a whole tax beneficial program, and Beeck Center has a whole program on that, which you can follow up on. I think, I mean, yes, there's ways to do tax policy to affect social change. So sure, there would be ways, but I think honestly, we'd have to have clear sense of what is or is not impact investment. So for example, community development finance institutions, CDFIs, you know, they're officially designated and there's some advantage, not necessarily tax. There's different advantages for that. If you're part of an opportunity zone, there's certain advantages for that as well. So bigger question, but great question. So.
And then we have one more. What have you found to be the biggest challenge in bridging sectors?
That's a great question. So I was working for a nonprofit and felt like I didn't understand the business terminology or world. And so I went to Wharton and I did a dual degree at University of Pennsylvania. So I would learn that and could be one of these multi-literate people able to work in different sectors. So I guess I would say, try to, you know, it sounds so basic, but empathy. So really listen to how people talk, what they say, explain, don't judge. Start with a person where they're at and explain to them without, you know, patronizing or judging them, but try to, you know, learn their language. And that's why I gave that example of the, you know, monitoring and evaluation versus key performance indicators, or equity, meaning healthcare access versus a balance sheet item. And so I think it's really just working with them. That's why people who have that trifecta, they know how to operate in those environments and they can be effective. But even if you haven't done that, or, you know, yet or ever, you can just listen and learn, and you know, their language and their culture, I guess I would say.
Thank you, Julie.
Great. So we're gonna go through the last part of the presentation. And I'm just going to warn you that because we only have 15 minutes left, we're going to go through really quickly, and we'll do a review in next week's session. So don't worry if you don't capture everything. So impact management considerations based on industry. There are a number of industries, and we go to the next slide, that historically have generated impact. And these include affordable housing, clean energy, health, small and medium enterprises, financial services, education. These industries are industries which by their nature are often generating some type of positive outcome for underserved communities. Now, that's not to say that every education deal is an impact deal or every health deal is an impact deal. But often in these sectors, you see impact being generated that benefits people or the planet. So I want to spend a moment on the next slide differentiating between outputs and outcomes. And this is really critical, I think, in any industry. And we touched on it a little bit in the first part of the presentation. But an output is a metric, generally a number, that is capturing a quantity of something that results from whatever activity you're doing. So it might be a good or a service. The outcome is the benefit to people and planet that's being created. And the example that I love to use, because it feels so clear cut, is education. You know, for a long time, organizations were primarily in the impact field, were primarily focused on how many students were being served. Sometimes you might also see an investor capture something like how many schools were being built or how many desks were available in a school. But those were quantitative outputs. And over time, people really began to understand in this work that using education as an example, what you really cared about was, did they learn something, right? Like you could have a room full of students, and if they aren't learning anything, then have you really accomplished anything from an impact standpoint? So outcomes capture what really matters in the long run, and we're going to see some examples of that as we roll through these next slides very quickly. So if you look at affordable and workforce housing, output metrics are easy to measure, and I want to be clear that it's still important to measure outputs. So my comment about the difference between the two is not to say that we don't want to measure outputs. We want to measure outputs and outcomes, and often you can't get to the outcome unless you are also measuring the output. So output metrics in workforce housing and affordable housing would include the number of units. It could also include affordability criteria and how many individuals you were serving at a certain area median income. Outcome measurements in affordable housing are actually very evidence-based, and there's a lot of research, including some randomized control studies, which tell you and explain the connection between building a safe, decent, affordable housing unit and people's ability to have a better standard of living, their actual health, improvements to the local economy that come out of single family home ownership, more stable employment opportunities, a lot of really good information about how outputs translate to outcomes in the affordable housing sphere. There's also a lot of great infrastructure, and I've listed just a couple of examples of organization that collect data, that provide support to impact investors in affordable housing, and that are specific to housing. We've also included here the GIN Affordable Housing Navigating Impact Project, which was a whole effort and initiative that the Global Impact Investing Network produced. And there are also lots of different types of certifications in this sphere. So these next couple slides, I'm going to move really quickly, but they include some of the same information for different industries. So in clean energy, we've got output metrics like greenhouse emissions reduced, reduction in use of fossil fuels, reduction in water waste. And then there are specific outcome measurements that look at things like improved health outcomes, which of course, there are many improved health outcomes that are proven around reduction in emissions, but also cost savings in some cases from reduced fossil fuel usage, or safety outcomes that are relevant for safer, cleaner uses of energy. There are also some impact industry resources. Series is a great resource for looking for information about clean energy impact management. So we keep moving and go to health, where outputs, same kind of thing that we were talking about earlier, is it's important. And yes, impact investors for a long time have been measuring the number of patients served, things like the number of vaccines. Relief organizations measure things like mosquito nets, which have great health outcomes. But what we really care about, what really matters, is did their health get better? Were mortality rates less? Were there less acute care needs? And was there a reduction or incident incidence or severity of diseases such as diabetes. So those are the things that we ultimately really care about when we're thinking about health, is what was the outcome that resulted because you made an investment in the outputs. I'm going to keep going because I want to make sure we leave some time here for general questions. We've talked about education, so I would say let's skip to the next one here. And small and medium enterprises, which in the US we traditionally call, or historically have called, just small business. Lots of output metrics there around jobs and capital received, new businesses created. But you want to think about, how does that connect with, what is your theory of change that connects output metrics with outcomes like improved family income and decreased poverty? And there's some great industry resources through these organizations that you can look into to find out more about impact management for small business, or what globally is referred to as small and medium enterprises. So I think there's one more slide here around financial services. So let's go to that. And this would be microfinance and community banking and community development financial institutions. Lots of good metrics here where you can compare across the sector. But you also want to be thinking about what are the outcome measurements around poverty reduction and wealth building. So I think that that's it on the industry considerations, or impact management considerations for industries. I want to do a quick poll here to capture if you're likely to use any of what you've learned here today. And then we're going to move to questions generally for me or for Julie. So I'm going to give this 5 more seconds. And we'll end polling. And it looks like we've got people who are planning to use this, which is good. I'll share results here. Most people will use it in class. Some can use it in work, some in their own day-to-day decision makings. And then there's a reasonably good other category. Feel free to make comments in the chat if you want to be more detailed in your response to this question about how what you learned is applicable. And oh, I forgot to share results. So there are the results for everyone to see. And I think now we are going to go to questions for either Julie or for me. And is that the next slide, Sonia? Are the questions?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. So we do have a question for Lisa. Based on your comment about RTCs earlier, then what is the main advantage for lean data approaches?
Yeah, so lean data is quicker. So randomized control studies can take a while to execute. And so it's more real-time information. And also there's a lot more flexibility to ask questions, to leave space for qualitative information. So often you get really good information from qualitative input from clients or stakeholders. So those are some of the benefits over an RTC. And again, I would not suggest that a randomized trial is a bad thing. It can give you very valuable information, but it does take a long time. Oh, and it's very expensive to execute. And lean data can be collected in a much less expensive manner using surveys and inputs or data entered through smartphones. It can be done pretty inexpensively.
Yeah, I would just add to what Lisa's really excellent points that, and I agree with all of them, that another factor is comparability. So for example, lean data, besides the features that Lisa mentioned, quicker, cheaper, et cetera, there's something, for example, called a Net Promoter Score, NPS, that can be determined between different, very distinct types of impact investments. And so and it's a numerical score, so you can compare investments in different sectors. So a housing, what was their NPS for a specific housing enterprise versus a health nonprofit. And so there's a bit more comparability for some of the measures than there might be for a randomized control trial, RCT.
Great. Any other questions, Deanna?
Yes, there's one for Julie. So this comes from an undergraduate student who is wondering if there is kind of a benefit between trying out private sector versus public sector if you're interested in impact careers.
No, that's a great question. So there is no one pathway. I think that, again, it depends if you're particularly interested very much in the financial and investment side of impact investing. I think that it can be helpful to work in an organization that does that, which may or may not be a nonprofit or for-profit. So for example, Calvert Impact Capital is a nonprofit, as are others, and Acumen was another example cited, but they have very much commercial, or not commercial, excuse me, but they have investing arms. I think there is a benefit, this is my bias, toward having private sector experience. There's a certain high bar, I would just say, when, you know, there's large private sector clients that expect, you know, the very best of everything. And that's, frankly, that's what I did. And that was great training for working in impact investing. I'm not saying it's the only way, but I think there's a certain understanding the mindset of a purely commercial investor, which once you understand that, and then you adapt that when you go into impact investing, I think can be very useful and powerful. But again, there's no one right answer. And I'm happy to hear Lisa's, she has comments on that too.
I would completely agree with your response, Julie.
Thank you.
So Lisa, this next question is for you. What is the difference between outcomes and overall impact of an investment opportunity? Certain project models in the impact investing market differentiate the two.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And, you know, there are a lot of critics of impact investing, and some of the critics, their main criticism is that it's not really impact that we're doing. It's outcomes. It really should be called outcomes financing. And in fact, there is a category of impact investing that people describe as outcome-based or results-based financing. But the difference has to do with the depth, scale, and duration. And so generally when the term impact is used, it's meant to be positive impact that is sustained over time, that has significant depth, and that is of some scale, right? So outcomes are usually shorter. They can be short-term or medium-term. And they can often be like a small intervention, kind of like a mini impact. So one way to think about it would be to say impact is really significant deep outcomes, and outcomes is kind of less, a little bit more shallow impact. but that's the difference between the two of them. And we are very lazy in impact investing. We use the terms quite interchangeably, but a social scientist would tell you that you can't really prove that you've had real impact without a randomized control study. And that you have to observe that impact over time for it to be real impact.
Then the next question is for either of you. What industries have we seen the main actions on ESG?
So I'm not an ESG expert. I think, though, the answer I would give is that really for ESG, you can look at it across any industry. And that because it's about best practices and ways of companies operating around governance, around what they do environmentally and around social, that it could be applied really to any industry. But Julie, I don't know if you want to take a stab at that.
No, I think you're right. I think it actually has to do more with a measure, an approach that companies use, also that publicly held companies use. And so as I agree with Lisa, that expands sectors and industries. For example, some funds would be asked, and they may have a very diverse portfolio, to run ESG screens on every company in their portfolio, whatever the holding. And then public companies, really it's a range of different sectors. And in fact, I think the concept of ESG initially really was not sector specific, because if you think about it, every company needs to look at or can look at all of those issues, certainly governance, and environmental and social also. So it didn't start from a specific sector. It really started from types of institutions, and therefore I think it was always intended to be pretty broad. That was my take.
Yeah. So I think we have maybe one more question, and then we should really close out because it's 7.
Yes, last question is, what kind of objectives might impact investors use that help them have strategic alignment?
Oh, no, that's a really great point. And part of the reason to have clarity on your objectives is so that you can find other investors that have the same objectives and goals, and potentially increase your impact through collective action. And so I do think that this the relevance of identifying your objectives is the thing that helps you to find aligned partners to invest together to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of your investment for impact. I do want to be mindful that it's 7, and we can follow up on this question some more when we get to next week's part 2 of the workshop. And please remember to sign up. We're going to leave you on the screen with some information about the Beeck Center and ways that you can stay connected with us. Please follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and sign up for our newsletter. And when you get the final deck, there'll be a link where you can click to sign up for the newsletter directly from the deck, as well as to visit our website. So for all those who registered, keep a lookout in your emails. You'll receive a copy of the slide presentation. And thank you is the final thing we want to say. Thank you so much to my colleagues, Deanna and Sonia, and to our special guest, Julie. So appreciate all your contributions to this session. And we look forward to seeing people next week, and please send us any feedback that you have that will make the next one even better. So, and for bearing with us through all of our technical challenges. You guys were a guinea pig for us doing a virtual workshop, and we didn't crash. So I'm very grateful that we stayed live for the whole time. And that we had so many people to join us. So thank you and take care.